running this for about the last 1.5 months with all nationally reputed examiners like you, so that our DM and DNB trainees get an exposure to a very broad range of questions and answers in cardiac anesthesia. So without delaying any further, sir, I would request you to start the session with our students. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, means somebody is going to present the case, no?
Yes, Dr.
Yes,
Somi. Dr. Somi, please introduce.
Sir,
Dr. Somi
yes,
will moderate.
yes, exactly. So, sir, actually, it is a proud privilege to announce the guest examiner of the day, which is very obvious now, Dr. Prabhat Tiwari. To most of us, he obviously requires no introduction, but to speak a few words. He has been the professor of cardiac anesthesia in SGPGI Lucknow for the past 30 years now. He has served as a past president of National IACTA body and is presently the chief editor of Annals of Cardiac Anesthesia. He is a member of the Representative Council of EACTA, representing India. He has delivered over 400 lectures and has, to his credit, more than 125 publications. So, sir, the class today is a mock viva on the long case of lung tumor for lobectomy. And the case will be presented by Dr. Pallav Mishra, who is a second-year DMPDT in IPGMER. I would also request the PDTs who will be facing the questions today to briefly, quickly introduce themselves to your examiner.
Sir, I am Dr. Pallav Mishra, SSKM Hospital. I will be presenting the case, sir.
Okay.
Sir, I am Dr. Satyajit from RN Tagore Hospital, DNB Cardiac Anesthesia, final year.
Okay, welcome.
So good afternoon. I am Dr. Soumitra Mukherjee, and I am a final year student in RN Tagore Hospital, Kolkata.
So I am Dr. Prachi Nag from RNT Hospital, Kolkata. I am also final year student.
Okay.
So I think that's these are the people who will be facing your questions, sir. So you can start. I think Pallav can start presenting the case.
Yes.
With your permission, sir.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. I will share my screen. Is my screen visible, sir?
Yes.
Shall I proceed, sir?
Sure.
Okay. Very good noon to everybody. Today, my case discussion. My patient is a 52-year-old male patient. He is a resident of Havra, Kolkata, and he is a banker by profession. He presented to our outpatient department with the chief presenting complaints of non-productive cough since past 2 years, reduced effort tolerance over past 1 year, and weight loss of approximately 3 kgs in past 3 months. Coming to the history of presenting complaints, the patient was apparently all right 2 years back when he developed increasing cough without any significant expectoration. Sputum currently is mucoid white and is not associated with any blood tinge, discoloration, any seasonal variation, but it increases with cigarette smoking and which reduced with inhaler medication. Patient complains that he has increasing fatigue and a reduced effort tolerance since past 1 year. This was seen while he used to perform daily activities like going for his regular work and would usually subside by taking his inhaler medicine or rest. He also complains that his clothes are getting loose over past 3 months, despite no significant change in his daily appetite or amount of his daily work that he undertakes. There's a negative history for any hematemesis, any night sweats, syncope, palpitations, orthopnea, paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea, fever, hoarseness of voice, peripheral edema, or ascites. His past history is significant for repeated hospital admissions 2 times in past 1 year with the development of lower respiratory tract infection, which was treated by the course of IV antibiotics. His last admission was 6 months back. The patient did not have the details, further details regarding the same. Coming to the personal history, he has a non-consanguineous marriage of 22 years duration with 2 living issues, a 14 and a 10-year-old boy. He follows a mixed diet and has a normal bowel and bladder habits. He's a cigarette smoker and is having 40 pack years history, and he has stopped it since past 3 months. His family history is not significant for any hypertension, type 2 diabetes, any coronary artery disease, asthma, epilepsy, tuberculosis, or malignancy in his family. Current treatment history includes inhaler salbutamol use, 400 mics puff SOS, tablet ranitidine, 150 milligrams once a day, multivitamin capsule, and nicotine chewing gum. Coming to his journal and physical examination, the patient consent was taken prior to his examination. Patient is sitting upright in the bed. He appears conscious, oriented, as coherent to time, place, and person. Anthropometric data shows a height of 164 centimeters, weight of 60 kgs, and a BMI of 22.3. His vitals includes a heart rate of 78 beats per minute. It's sinus regular, normovolemic. There is no special character. There is no radial or radiofemoral delay. And vessel wall is palpable, and the pulses are equal in all the extremities. His non-invasive blood pressure is 130/70 millimeters of mercury in the right upper limb in sitting posture. He has a respiratory rate of 18 breaths per minute, which is thoraco-abdominal. Temperature is 98 degrees Fahrenheit in the axilla. His room air saturation is 98% on room air. JVP is normal. There is no pallor, no icterus, but there is a grade 2 clubbing in both the upper and lower extremities. There is no chylomicronia, lymphadenopathy, or any edema. Coming to his airway examination, he has a mouth opening of 3 finger breaths. TM joint mobility is normal. Neck mobility is normal, and his Malampatti grade 2. Coming to the systemic examination, the respiratory system on inspection, in the sitting posture, the trachea looks central. There is a reduced chest expansion anteriorly in the right supramammary region. There are no visible scar sinuses, dilated veins over the chest wall. On palpation, the inspectory findings are confirmed. The chest expansion is 4 centimeter overall, but it is 3 centimeter in the right interscapular region. The anteroposterior to lateral chest diameter is 1:1.5. Tactile fragmentus is poorly conducted in the right supramammary region. On percussion, all the lung regions are resonant except for the right suprascapular and the right supramammary region where a dull note was observed. On hepatic dullness is seen in the right fifth intercostal space in the mid-clavicular line. Cardiac dullness, the upper border is in the left second intercostal space, and the lower border is in the left fifth intercostal space at the point of apex beat. On auscultation, bronchial breath sounds heard over the trachea, vesicular breath sounds all over the lung fields except the right supramammary, suprascapular region, and it are poorly conducted breath sounds. There's wheezing in the right supramammary region in the supine position, which tends to disappear in a sitting posture. Vocal resonance is dull in the right supramammary region. Cardiovascular examination, first and second heart sounds are heard. There are no added murmurs. The apex beat is localized to the left fifth intercostal space in the mid-clavicular line. He gives an effort tolerance of climbing 3 flights of stairs. Coming to the central nervous system, higher mental functions are normal. There are no obvious cranial, motor, or sensory deficits. GI examination, the bowel sounds are appreciated. There's no organomegaly or ascites. And on musculoskeletal examination, it's a normal range of motion in all the extremities with no limitations. So I would summarize, my patient as a 52-year-old resident of Havra with non-productive cough, increasing in intensity over past 2 years, exacerbated with smoking but was relieved with inhaler. He has a reduced effort tolerance since past 1 year with 3 kilograms of weight loss in past 3 months, and his modified medical research grade is status 2. He had recurrent hospitalizations for a lower respiratory tract infection, which was managed with IV antibiotics, with a significant personal history of smoking of 40 pack years, which he left 3 months ago. Examination revealed reduced chest wall excursion in the right supramammary region with dull percussion note in the right suprascapular and supramammary region, with wheezing clearing on positional change from supine to sitting posture. So should I continue with the investigation, sir?
Well, on the basis of this history and all, what do you think your some provisional diagnosis could be?
Sir, my provisional diagnosis...
Can I have the faces of all the students so that the main person whom I'm going to ask is the presenter, and the others, if supposing others, I want to ask others so that they can just raise hands. and they can tell me. So I want to involve all the students, right? With this history, what do you think? What could be the provisional diagnosis?
So provisionally,
Some assumptions.
yes, sir. So since this patient complains of a non-productive cough, which has progressively increased over past 2 years, and there was also history of infection previously, along with a significant recent history of weight loss and a significant smoking history of around 40 pack years, I would like to keep lung malignancy as one of the provisional diagnosis. Apart from that, sir, any infective etiology, I can consider like maybe it can be a tubercular mass also, which can be a possibility as it's a common condition in our country, or it can be a hamartoma, or it can be a granulomatous lesion.
Hamartoma. Never jump to these kind of diagnosis. You know, hamartoma. You just can't say it on your theory presentation. All right. So don't pinpoint that it could be hamartoma or whatever. All right. So it could be infective pathology, maybe tuberculosis, Indian region, and
Yes,
it could be a malignancy, right? So what
Right.
favors malignancy and what favors infective pathology?
So infective pathology, as he gives a history.
What you have told up till now.
Yes. Yeah, right, sir. So if I consider infection as a history, this patient gives me a history that he had a past history of 2 admissions to the hospital for lower respiratory tract infections. And he gave a history that he was treated with IV antibiotics. So I could consider that maybe if the infection is a resistant infection and it is persistent, there may be an empyema, which is lung empyema can be there, or a lung abscess. Which can be a possibility if it has not resolved. That can be one possibility. And other things, sir, that since this patient has the strong history of smoking and a recent history of weight loss, which is present, also takes me towards thinking that probably it can be a lung malignancy. So these are 2 important things. And even on the examination, sir, I could find that this patient has a wheeze which changed with posture, particularly like when he turns from a supine to a sitting posture, the wheeze tends to go away. So probably it is a mass which is like compressing the bronchus.
Why it happens like that? Why it behaves like that? If supposing you are thinking that it is a mass, then why you corroborate with this kind of specific finding that by changing the posture, the symptoms are rather improving. When he sits, he becomes better as compared to the supine position. How do you explain it?
Sir, because this mass possibly can be like in the supine position, since the dependent parts of the lung, that is usually the posterior lobe, and if the malignancies usually are tend to involve the upper and the middle zones, if it's like a central malignancy, if you are thinking in terms of that, that can cause compression of the main bronchus, sir. So while lying down position, because of the dependent position, it can compress upon the bronchus and it can produce a distress or wheezing in patient. And as soon as he like sits up, because because of if the mass may move away from the bronchus which was getting occluded, so he may have relief of the symptoms.
Okay. All right. Soumitra, you can add something to this?
Sir, what Dr. Pallab say, I will also have the same explanation that whenever the patient is in lying down position, rather in a supine position, probably the mass is compressing some major airway like bronchus or that is a conducting airway. So there will be wheeze, and whenever the patient attains a sitting posture, this compression effect is gone. So the patency of airway is resumed. That's why the wheeze is also resolved.
Okay, Pallav, can you carry on with the further what you do as far as
Okay,
investigations are concerned?
I just share my screen, sir, again. Is my screen visible, sir?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll start with the investigations. Hemogram was done, suggestive of hemoglobin of 14.8, a total count of 11,780. Differentials within the normal range, platelets of 1.6, a Paxil volume of 42%, mean corpuscular hemoglobin 32, MCV of 84, and MCHC of 30 grams. Coagulation parameters, the bleeding time was 3 minutes, clotting time 7 minutes, and INR of 1.1. Liver function test revealed a total bilirubin of 1.2, direct bilirubin of 0.7, a total protein of 6.8, albumin 3.4, globulin 3 gram percent, TSG, OTPT, ALP within normal limits. Renal function test revealed a urea of 40, creatinine 1.1, and electrolytes seem to be within normal limits. We checked the COVID RT-PCR, which was negative for this patient. A sputum routine microscopy was done, which was negative for AFB or the Gram stain. And a bronchoscopy with biopsy was done, which suggested a squamous cell carcinoma without hilar lymph node involvement. A spirometry was done, which showed slightly reduced forced vital capacity and expiratory volume in the first second, but the ratio tends to be normal. The maximum voluntary ventilation and forced expiratory flow, 25 to 75%, seems to be within normal. This is the ECG, which reveals normal sinus rhythm with the rate of about 80 beats per minute and no major significant changes. This is the chest X-ray of the patient, showing haziness in the right upper lobe and also abutting the right middle lobe on the and there is slight tenting of diaphragm on the right side. These are the CT scans showing the mediastinal and the lung windows. There was the trachea seems to be central, and there was no any apparent compression of the airways or no any vascular compression. And a mass could be appreciated in the right upper lobe, which is a heterogeneous mass and measuring roughly 5.5 into 6 centimeters, abutting the right bronchus, right mainstem bronchus. I'm done, sir, with my investigation, sir.
Okay. All right. So now you add your all the investigations to the history. So can we improve upon our differential diagnosis?
Yes, sir. Now, after I investigate the patient further, this looks to be a squamous cell carcinoma, which has been
And don't straight away go to squamous cell carcinoma. Refrain from doing that, right? You just build up the story around all the investigations. What are the positive points you found, right? And then you say that it is a mass which has been bronchoscopic biopsy proved. So that is how you present, okay? So you tell me.
Sir, on further investigation, we found that
because
there
see,
is
whenever you are, see, examination is only a part of one part of your whole training and the way you conduct your life. See, every day will be an examination. You will get a patient, and so how will you proceed with that patient? All right, that's what you are learning here. That's what you are telling to me. So exactly do the way you do all the times. All right.
So, sir, on further investigations, we find in this patient that on bronchoscopy and biopsy, the biopsy specimen was significant for a lung malignancy, which
No, Pallav, first of all, see, you don't straight away start inserting the scope in any patient. It is a bit invasive. You must have done a CT, a chest X-ray beforehand. Don't you think so?
Right.
Yes, so it should take a precedence over invasive thing. You just can't straight away place a scope inside somebody. All right?
Right.
So start from non-invasive investigations and then go to the invasive part because they are confirmatory. You are lifting a biopsy,
Right.
that is a confirmatory test which you have done. All right?
So, sir, in this patient, the significant findings which we found was that on an X-ray, there was a homogeneous density which was seen occupying the right upper lobe and also probably involving the right side middle lobe. There was some increased reticulations which were seen in the right side lower lobe with slight tenting of the diaphragm. On further going ahead with a non-contrast CT scan of the chest, we found that there was a mass which was a non-homogeneous mass seen in the right upper lobe abutting the right side bronchus, which was measuring about 5.5 into 6 centimeter with no significant tracheal airway involvement or the involvement of the vasculature or any significant lymph nodes which could be appreciated, following which a bronchoscopic biopsy was undertaken for this patient. And the bronchoscopic biopsy further revealed that this was a squamous cell carcinoma involving the right upper lobe with no hilar involvement. So it's a T1 stage, T1N0, M0 stage of cancer.
Correct. See, that is how, when you do it, then you make a better impression, you see, on the patient, on everybody, or the your seniors or your examiners, in which you are more interested at this moment of time, because of course you have to pass your exam. All right. So you were emphasizing on tenting of the diaphragm. So what you are implying by that?
Sir, I wanted to say that the diaphragm looks to be slightly pulled up because normally the left side diaphragm tends to be lower and the right side diaphragm tends to be slightly on a higher side because the liver is placed on the right. And here we could see that there was slight tenting on the medial aspect of the diaphragm. So this I could relate probably as patient had repeated lower respiratory tract infections and probably of the resolved pneumonia. There may be some amount of fibrosis which could have happened in the lower lobe of the lung. And this could have caused some retraction. And probably because of that, or maybe because that could be like one of the reasons as to why we might get a change in the normal contour of the diaphragm. So that is what my thinking was.
Okay. All right. So what do you think? What should be done to this patient? What you are going to offer to this patient?
Sir, first of all, we would like to tell the patient about the diagnosis which he has received. And since it's a malignancy, definitely we need to counsel the patient because
a squamous cell carcinoma. Squamous cell carcinoma? Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir. So, so this squamous cell carcinoma comes under the non-small cell carcinoma lung category. And this is something which is amenable to surgical treatment, and patient can improve with surgery as still it is in a T1N0 stage. So an early surgery can be fruitful for this patient and we can halt the progress of the disease. Whereas if this would have involved the lymph nodes, then probably chemoradiotherapy would have been would be therapy of choice per se. So we would like to tell the patient about the pros and cons of getting a surgery done for this mass and getting probably getting a lobectomy in this patient for this mass done. And I would like to explain him the benefits as well as the risks involved in the procedure. And once the patient agrees to the surgery, then we can proceed for any further investigation in this patient so as to assess his lung dynamics. And we can go ahead with surgery.
Okay. So if I can ask somebody else, there is Soumitra and there is Prachi also. I think Satyajit is there. Prachi is there.
Yes, sir.
So, okay. So if supposing we have decided and patient has consented that, okay, we go for some surgery to remove this mass. So how will you proceed with the further investigations in this case?
So actually the investigations and history are there with us. Ideally, we are supposed to go for a risk assessment in this patient. So we have to do a cardiac risk and then we go for the pulmonary risk assessment. In the cardiac risk assessment, we follow the revised cardiac risk index and just find out from the history if the patient has a recent history of any ischemic heart disease or the patient has
No, but he has none.
Okay, so then
So
sir,
why should we beat around the bush? First of all, we tackle the lesion for which surgery is being offered, right?
Okay, sir.
So
Yes,
instead of looking at the heart, we have already seen up till now, ECG was fine, and he can climb up, I think, 3 stairs.
Okay,
that's what Pallav told. So it is better if we look at, first of all,
So
what surgery we are going
prehabilitation-
to offer, and then how we evaluate.
So because initially he has said it is the right upper lobe that has been involved in this patient according to the CT reports. So it will be the patient could go for a right upper lobectomy if the lesion is involved in the right upper lobe, sir. So before doing any surgery involving the lung, we have to do what is called as a prehabilitation of the patient. So primarily the patient should be seen before the surgery. It will be ideal if we can see it before 2 to 4 weeks because the patient is an active smoker who has just quit smoking. So for the ideal time, it will be around a month to after quitting smoking because the sputum production and the reactivity of the airway also decreases. But if not, at least 2 weeks of time has to be given for the cessation of smoking in these patients. So the reversible effects of carbon monoxide are also reversed, which get reversed in 2 to 3 days. And rest of the things like recovery of the ciliary function and all will be available after 2 weeks. After doing this, the patient can be put on bronchodilator.
Why this recovery is important?
So because it will affect the post-operative recovery of the patient, sir. Post-operatively, this and intraoperatively, he can go into sudden bronchospasm also if the patient is not actively is not optimized pre-operatively.
I will not buy this that in intraoperative period he goes in bronchospasm. But what you said about the post-operative care, that is very, very important.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Sir, then beyond that, if the patient requires any bronchodilators, he should be given on bronchodilators or nebulization.
He is on bronchodilators. He is taking bronchodilators.
That has to be continued, sir. That has to be
yeah, he will
continue.
I think disease makes the patient quite intelligent. He will continue.
Spirometry has to be taught, like the incentive spirometry has to be taught, that is deep breathing exercises and all this has to be taught before the surgery to the patient so that it will facilitate a faster recovery in the post-operative period for these patients, because this is what they have to combat in the post-operative period, so that early extubating is not an issue, but after that course how the patient operates.
Prachi, you are slightly beating around the bush. Actually, you have to restrict yourself to what actually you want to see. You said that, well, you will build up the patient, but what actually you want to see, right? What is his effort as far as breathing is concerned, as far as his respiration is concerned? That is, you are going to evaluate.
So the FEV
you are taking out the lobe, right?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, so as per the guidelines, what we have read, sir, we go for the pulmonary function test. What we go for is the FEV1 and the DLCO, sir, diffusion lung capacity for carbon monoxide. So we see which one is less than around 80% of the predicted normal, sir. So if they both are more than 80%, the patient can go for the surgery. But if either one of them is less than 80%, we go for an exercise testing of the patient. Okay, sir. So the exercise testing, we can go for this is a 6-minute
80%,
walk.
80% is very much normal.
Sir, sir, actually, I've just read it recently.
Satyajit, what is your opinion? Satyajit, somehow.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
I am here, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Sir, I think the preoperative evaluation can be evolved around the lung mechanics, assessment of the lung mechanics, cardiopulmonary reserve, and the lung parenchymal function. So first we have to assess the preoperative predicted postoperative FEV1 and the ABG analysis and the lung parenchymal function like the diffusion of the DLCO. This is the diffusion capacity of carbon monoxide. If we assess the predicted postoperative FEV1, it can be assessed by the preoperative FEV1 into 1 minus percentage of the lung removed divided by 100. If it is more than 40%, then this is a low risk surgery. If it is 30 to 40%, it is moderate risk surgery. If it is less than 30%, it is a high risk surgery. Then you can assess the ABG, baseline ABG on the room air. If the PO2 is 60 millimeter of mercury and the PCO2 is more than 45 millimeter of mercury, this can poses a significant risk in the postoperative period. And then we can assess the DLCO, diffusion capacity of carbon monoxide. It actually assesses the effective area of the oxygenation of the effective area. So this is also, if it is less than 40%, it is a if it is less than 30%, it is a high risk. If it is more than 40%, it is low risk. And if it is in between 30 to 40%, it is intermediate risk surgery. And for cardiopulmonary reserve, we can check for the stair climbing test and also to assess the VO2 max.
Just hold on. Soumitra, supposing this patient has slightly less than 60% of FEV1 and DLCO, right?
Yes.
Now, you want to put some effort,
Yes.
and then see
Yes.
that how his reserves work. So,
Sir,
what do you do?
If both the predictive postoperative FEV1 and predictive postoperative DLCO is more than 60%, then it is okay. Straightforward, we'll go for the surgery. But if either of them is less than 60%, that is 30 to 60%, we will do a 6-minute walk test, which is actually a parameter to assess the cardiopulmonary interaction. If the 6-minute walk test is more than 400 meter, then again we can go for the surgery. But if the 6-minute walk test is less than 400 meter, we have to do another cardiopulmonary interaction test. That is the estimation of maximum oxygen consumption. That is the VO2 max. If the
6-minute walk test has not been properly verified, right? There are other walk tests which have been verified and documented.
We can go for the shuttle walk test.
They give you more information.
So we can go for the shuttle walk test where there are 2 points.
Shuttle walk test and what he said about the stairs.
Stair climbing test, sir. Stair climbing test. In stair climbing test, if the patient is able to...
He said that the patient was able to climb 3 stairs.
Then it's okay.
Right?
It's
Is
okay.
it? Are you sure?
Yes, sir. Climbing of flight of more than 2 flight of stairs means the MAID score more than 4. So if the MAID score is more than 4, then it's okay for the patient. We can go for the surgery.
But the respiratory surgeons, the thoracic surgeons don't agree to that. They look at
Okay.
something else.
Sir, in stair climbing test, there is no mentions of the height of the stairs and the number of the stairs. So it may be ambiguous. So if it is more than 20 meters of height, they can reach. So it considered as a adequate for the stair climbing
Yes.
test.
So the height achieved is more important than counting the number of stairs. As Satyajit rightly said, that how much height you actually gain, because you are carrying that much of weight up to that height. So that brings in effort, right? So that is important. So it is around, you said 20, or you are very much near it. It is around 22 or slightly more than that. So that is the cutoff for the stair climbing test. And other is your shuttle. Now, what is shuttle walk test?
Sir, in shuttle walk test, 2 point are fixed 10 meters apart, and patient is asked to walk in between these 2 points and in a normal pace. Okay, and then the oxygen saturation is estimated, as well as the VO2 max is estimated. If the VO2 max is more than 15 ml per kg per minute, it is patient is
that is not a measurement. That is only a prediction. You know,
prediction.
Right.
And
so no, shuttle walk test. What happens? There is a machine that gives you a click, and when that machine gives a click, then the person has to increase the speed of movement. So it is a progressive increase of the movement between the 2 points, 10 meters apart. That is how, because you can just loiter around without putting any effort. All right. So the test will become negative. You will not reach to any conclusion. So that is important, how you are performing the test. Okay.
Okay, sir.
So if supposing if you don't find that the patient is not able to achieve 22 meters or not able to by the shuttle walk test,
sir, then I will calculate the maximum oxygen consumption, that is the VO2 max.
How it is done? Who else? Satyajit, Soumitra, Pallav, Prachi. Who else is left? Some other student is there?
No, sir. No, sir.
These are 4 only, no?
Yes, sir. There are 4 today.
Okay. So, Pallav, now supposing after these walk tests, still it is not confirmed, right? You still have some doubts. So, how do you measure?
Sir, it depends, like, is the patient not able to do the exercise? If he's not able to do the exercise, we can perform a ventilation perfusion scan for such patients, in which patient is given an...
ventilation perfusion scan gives you what kind of specific information?
Sir, it tells us about the segment which is going to be resected. What is the degree of perfusion to that area? And through that we can
you can calculate what will happen after you remove that segment.
Yes, sir.
Right. So what will be the predicted FEV1? What will be predicted DLC? For that is important. But once you are assessing the patient, then you straight away don't take him for perfusion scan again. See, you have to put a dye. Patient, you have to take him to either radiology suite or a nuclear medicine suite where you actually do it. So before that, which is a better way of assessing the patient? Soumitra was referring to it. Yes, cardio?
CPET.
Pulmonary exercise testing can be done.
Yes, the ergospirometry or cardiopulmonary exercises. What is that?
So cardiopulmonary exercise testing is basically a procedure by which the cardiopulmonary interaction, whereby the oxygen comes into the alveoli, then it's transferred to the peripheral tissue, and from the peripheral tissue, the carbon dioxide, which is transported back into the alveoli, this circulation is actually being tested. So there are two methods. Either we can do it by a bicycle ergometry, or it can be done as a treadmill test.
Well, means, procedure is the same. The only difference is how your patient walks. If he has good knees, he can cycle, put him on the cycle. If he can only walk, keep his legs straight, put him on the treadmill. So it is not the two ways. Means this is how you just put an effort.
And sir, in this we measure the various parameters. Like in the resting state, we see what is the heart rate, the ECG.
No, we are doing this elaborate exercise for a very specific parameter. And what is that?
So we want to see the VO2 max, and we want to see
what
the
is
VCO.
That? What is VO2 max?
So that is the maximum amount of oxygen consumption which
Yes.
is undertaken, and correspondingly what is the amount of carbon dioxide which is generated, and we basically draw a plot in which we tend to see the various other parameters.
Yeah, that is fine. That is fine. But for this patient, just looking at the oxygen consumption is enough. So what are the cutoffs?
So if it is more than 20 ml per kg per minute, that is considered normal. If it is between 10 to 15 ml per kg per minute, it is like borderline. And if it is below 10 ml per kg per minute, then surgery should not be contemplated. We should look for other modifying factors, or surgery immediately it should not be undertaken.
Correct. So that is how you actually evaluate. And then you come to the other aspect, that is the post-operative predicted FEV1 in DLCO. Prachi, what do you do for that?
Sir, in that we take we delete the number of obstructed segments, and then what we do is 90 minus what actually the formula is post-operative pre-operative value upon T into R. Okay, so T is the number of functioning segments that are there, and R is the number of segments that are to be resected. So PPU values can be pre-operative value into R upon T, not T into R upon T, sir, sorry. So R is the resected segments, unobstructed, and T is the number of total segments which are unobstructed. So this is on the basis of this we can calculate for DLCO, we can calculate for FEV1. This is the way we calculate the post-operative predictive FEV1, and accordingly we can stratify, as has been said, is less than 40% the patient is at the high risk, and more than 70 to 80% the patient can very well go for surgery, sir.
Okay. So this assessment is very important. Supposing you find that, well, your patient did very well on your walk test, and he is, because lesion is not too big, not involving too much of right-sided lung, and he can generate a good amount of oxygen consumption on your ergospirometry, all right? And prediction is more than 60%, post-operative prediction. So how will you go ahead with the surgery? Allah?
Sir, first of all, we'll take the consent. As the consent has been taken, nowadays there is a role of enhanced recovery after surgery. We can follow the ERAS protocol, in which we would first of all like to do a good counseling for the patient, and we would like to tell him the surgical plan, discuss with him the surgical plan and what kind of post-operative pain management strategy we'll be using for this patient. And we will also encourage, if since this patient has stopped smoking, but if somebody has not stopped smoking, it is advisable to make sure that he stops smoking, and should consider incentive spirometry before the procedure. Secondly, we should also consider telling him about the risks which are involved with the surgery and what kind of complications can be expected in the post-operative period. Going into the pre-operative period, just before a day of the surgery, we can consider keeping the patient NBM nilparole for about 6 hours for solid, but 2 hours prior to the surgery, we can give a carbohydrate load to the patients, as it has been found that this tends to improve the insulin sensitivity in the post-operative period, and also tends to be beneficial. we should do a good counseling. Psychological counseling should be done, and we should avoid any sedatives as such. But if required, anxiolytics can be given, sir, to the patient. And appropriate blood products we would like to reserve for this surgery, depending upon the center experience and the surgical risk involved. Then on the day of surgery, we would like to check the surgical WHO surgical safety list before taking up the patient inside the operation theater. Before taking him into the operation theater, we should make sure that the patient is warm, and if required, we can use forced air warming blankets in this patient. And since this patient has a malignancy, they also have risk for venous thromboembolism. So I would also like to consider giving him a low molecular weight heparin day before the surgery. And if I'm planning an epidural, then I can probably
Why you want to give low molecular weight heparin to begin with? He is walking. He is walking. He is very active.
So
you may create problems for yourself. That can be kept for the post-operative period. Why you need it to give in the beginning, pre-operative?
So considering the malignancy which has been diagnosed in this patient.
See, you have to always weigh pros and cons of anything, right? You cannot be fixated to one thing. That malignancy causes this and all. You will do your hemograms, you will do your all the coagulation tests and all that, right? And so, did you do in this patient? Was he all right?
His INR
was INR and all?
Yes, sir. It was normal, 1.1.
Yeah, so it's fine. You can, naturally, you will give it in the post-operative period. But why you want to increase your problems intra-op? You don't know how this low molecular weight heparin will interact, right?
Then, yes, sir. So then, if I'm not using low molecular weight heparin, I can go for mechanical stockings if they are available as a prevention for DVT.
That has to be given in the once the patient lies supine in the OR. That has to be placed in this kind of patient.
Right. Then I would like
Satyajit, can you take one from here?
Yes, sir. Patient is in the OR, and all the precautionary measures like for DVT prophylaxis were entangled. Then we put the monitor.
That has been taken care of. Now let's go. We have to do surgery in the thorax, upper thorax.
Yes, sir.
Forget about DVT for a moment.
Yes, sir. Then we put the routine monitoring system, ASM monitoring system. And all others. After putting the
what others?
We put arterial line, and central venous pressure monitoring. We put the CVP line and the arterial line. And
you like to place in the awake patient central venous line and all that?
Under local anesthesia, usually.
But why you want to make your patient very anxious and all that by putting thick lines on the neck?
Okay, sir. In our institute,
don't say okay. You tell me what you want to do. I may be wrong.
Sir, in our institute, we usually put before induction, we usually put the central venous line and the arterial line under local anesthesia.
The arterial line is fine. I'm talking about the thick central line. You must be putting it either 3 lumen or 4 lumen. Nobody uses single lumen, huh?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So thick cannulae. We have to look at the anxiety of the patient as well.
Yes, sir. Yes,
right?
Sir. So after establishing a peripheral wide bore peripheral cannula, we put the patient under induction and intubation, and then also we can put the central venous catheter line.
Don't you think of putting any epidural catheter or something like that beforehand?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thoracic epidural must be given for this patient because of the.
Do you do it or not? You forgot. It means you don't do it. Right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, no problems. It happens. Yes. Yes, there are different centers have different ways of tackling, but pain is a very important thing to be taken care of in the post-operative period, and especially in thoracic pains. These are very severe pains, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and it is a very wide incision when you are tackling masses inside the thorax.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, because surgeon has to have a complete access of hilum and all that, because you don't know. You may have severe bleeding, there may be some catastrophe, and then the hilum has to be right in front so that that can be checked. So it is a big, wide incision the surgeons apply. They don't, unless of course they are trying to do this with a VATS procedure.
Usually, the ideally should the epidural thoracic epidural catheter.
No, that is not ideal, right? It is a pendulum swinging to the other end. It's not ideal, but it is something which can be used, which can be placed in the beginning, and can be used during the surgery as well as once you wake him up after surgery in the OR, patient may be totally pain-free because of this epidural. Okay, so, well, then what do you do? What are the major concerns at this point of time? I think we have to hurry up because we can't just be on Zoom for so long. We have already, I think, 1 hour. We are reaching 1 hour.
Yes, sir. Major concerns are the double lumen tube in lung isolation.
No, that is not the concern. What is the concern? Double lumen tube is not the concern. Patient is the concern. What do you actually want to do?
Positioning of the patient and lung
what
isolation.
Double lumen tube? Why you talked about double lumen tube?
Lung isolation.
Yes, the lung isolation, right? You are thinking about the lung isolation, you are thinking about the one lung ventilation, and all the problems which can occur because of that, right? So proper selection of the device is important. So what do you use in this one for lung isolation in this patient?
In this patient,
it has a right-sided upper thoracic mass.
Yes, left-sided double lumen tube. Usually we insert the left-sided double lumen tube.
We use it. Why the left-sided? What do you mean by left-sided?
The position of the patient is right up, and the left is a dependent position.
No. I'm talking about, you said left-sided double lumen tube. So
yes, sir. I mean,
what does this mean? Left-sided means what?
The bronchial lumen, the double lumen to the bronchial lumen is the left bronchus, okay. And that is the left-sided tube.
So why mass is on the right side? Why still you are going for a left-sided, this bronchial double lumen tube?
Because the right upper lobar pathology, right-sided double lumen tube may causes the problem, may causes insertion problem because of the right upper lobar pathology. Usually we use the left-sided double lumen tube.
So Soumitra, can you elaborate upon that?
Sir, as the pathology is in the right side, we can put the right-sided double lumen tube.
You can put the right-sided double lumen tube, okay? But what could be the problems?
The problem could be placement of right-sided double lumen tube is difficult as because the orifice for the right upper lobe bronchus, it originates just 1.5 to 2 centimeter from the carina. So the safety margin is very low. So, and most of the times before going into the one lung ventilation, while we are trying for the two lung ventilation and before opening the chest, there is possibility of hypoventilation in the right sided lung. So it is
But
difficult.
don't you think that in this case in particular, if supposing the right upper lobe is not getting ventilated, that is what actually you want.
Sir, it is exactly. It is we will
Because surgery will be on the right side, right?
But
whether means it may be totally non-ventilating the upper lobe.
Sir, before commencement of the one lung ventilation, we require bilateral ventilation, lung ventilation. So on that situation, prior to the commencement of one lung ventilation, it will be difficulty to maintain the saturation and normal PO2.
But you cannot rely upon this lobe, because you see, when the patient was lying down, there was hardly any air entry in that lung. That's what came out from the history, no?
Yes, sir.
Pallav,
sir, actually,
was that the history?
Sir, for both.
Yes, Pallav, you wanted to say
that? We found that the wheezing improved, sir, which was more in the supine position. But as the patient was going to the sitting position, the wheezing would resolve. That was the finding.
So it means when the patient was lying supine, then there was issues of air entry.
Yes, sir.
In that region. So how will you justify your right-sided tube? Okay, so so what's the good thing about the left-sided tube?
The left-sided tube can be used for both left-sided lung surgery as well as right-sided lung surgery.
No, don't say that, Soumitra. We know that we have to do on the right side, the surgery on the right side. So there is no question of operating on the left side, unless you want yourself to be getting dragged into the court and losing your license.
Sorry, sir.
Right? There are other things, you know. You also want a procedure which can be easily done with more efficiency and more less problems. Is easier, right? There is more margin of safety. Left-sided main bronchus is longer, right? Because these balloons, they can actually move out, right? They can move forward, they can move out, they can create all kind of problems.
There could be displacement of the malposition of the double lumen tube also.
Right? So if you are getting a longer lumen, right, where the balloon can stay for a longer time without getting displaced, I think that makes more sense. What else can be used in place of anything else can be used in this particular patient?
Sir, apart from the double lumen tube, we can use the bronchial blockers.
Are you sure?
Sir, frankly speaking,
bronchial blocker in this patient?
Sir, I have no experience about this because I have not used.
Okay. Anybody has experience of using blockers? Satyajit, Pallav, Prachi? Then please read it. Read it properly for your exams and also for future. You may get sometimes to use these blockers. That's why they are not preferred on the right side. And when they are actually preferred, okay, so it is important. Now, supposing you place the double lumen tube, and then what is important? Do you use it blindly, or you always confirm the position with FOB?
Sir, the confirmation of the position should be done in two ways. Number one, by occasion, and number two, by fiber optic bronchoscope guidance. So both of them should be used always once the patient is...
Prachi, what you look at when you are checking with an FOB?
So when we
Soumi, please tell me when to stop.
Sir, I think it's a 2-hour. We usually have a 2-hour class.
Okay.
So
okay.
we
so
can extend it to 2.5 hours. We can
So
extend it to 1 hour more.
So how many
4:35.
minutes?
I think it's 4:35. So we can continue till 5:35 maybe.
Okay. So everybody can have access to tea and all, so that nobody drops dead, I hope so. Boys, you people have got access to tea?
Yes,
I
sir.
got my.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So Prachi,
yes, sir.
so when you introduce FOB, what you want to see actually? You have placed a left-sided double lumen tube.
Sir, first of all, what we go in is we go through the tracheal lumen, then we go distally reach the carina. From there, we should be able to see the endobronchial cuff that is placed on the left side. So we can see the blue balloon from that. We enter on the left side. What we see on the left side will be the...
we usually don't enter because...
We just see the...
Have you seen the lumen of the bronchial part of that tube? It is very
narrow,
difficult to insert an adult FOB through that. If you have a pediatric
we have
FOB,
a pediatric, sir. Yeah, we use a pediatric.
Well, then keep
FOB.
pediatric for pediatrics. Why do unnecessary waste on an adult? They are
sir.
costly equipment, right? So
Yes, sir.
by just going through the tracheal lumen, what you want to look?
So through the tracheal lumen, we have to see that the bronchial, we can see the bronchial cuff is placed in the left-sided main bronchus and not, it is not abutting into the carina, sir. That is what I wanted to say. And then we go further inside and we can see the opening of the
balloon,
left upper lobe.
Where the balloon has to be placed?
Within the just beyond the within the opening of the left upper lobe bronchus.
It should not be coming out of the orifice.
Out of the yes, sir.
On the left side.
Orifice, sir.
It has to be completely inside the bronchus.
Yes,
right,
sir.
and then your tube is taped so that you are secure that this balloon will not come out or slip out into the carina.
Yes, sir.
That is important, and that is on the left side. And what else you are going to see?
Sir, openings of the in the left upper lobe bronchus, sir. We can see the 3 openings.
No. You have already placed an endotracheal tube on the left side. The left limb of this double lumen tube on the left
side.
Yes, so that is secure. On the right side, do you see something or not?
Sir, on the right side. Right side, we just check the opening of the right upper lobe bronchus.
Very important. You have to check that it is not, because there is a mass.
Yes, sir.
Now this mass can disfigure. You see, there is a history that the patient, when lies down, there are problems. So there may be disfiguring. There may be some compression. There may be some problems. See, once you start actually using that tube, you may have increased airway pressures. So you have to assess the right-sided openings, right?
Yes,
if there is no compression, nothing is there, you have to go right inside and look at all the orifices on the right side. Supposing post-surgery, right, by mistake, surgeon have taken some hitch around, he has taken off the upper lobe on the right side, but when he is actually stitching, those stitches may hitch the other bronchuses also. So those bronchi, so in the beginning you have to look at, and you have to make a note.
Okay.
in the file that you have actually examined the whole right-sided bronchial system. That is equally important when you are actually separating out the lungs. Okay?
Yes, sir.
So once the tube is in and you are going to, how will you position this patient?
Sir, if it will be a left lateral thoracotomy. So it will be a right up, left lateral thoracotomy. So
Right
left lateral
up.
position with a right up, yeah.
And
And the lower limb will be flexed at the knee joint. The upper leg will be straight, and the lower arm will be abducted, and the upper arm will be again abducted on a I would say it will be on a sling in a 90 degrees position to the horizontal plane. So about these two arms, and we have to take care that we avoid any nerve injuries. So adequate padding should be given under the lower hip and below the low elbow of the lower arm, sir, left arm. That is all.
one thing you missed, very important. What is that?
Positioning, sir.
In positioning, you told the positioning quite well, but one thing is you missed.
Chest.
That is very important for the surgeon.
Chest.
Satyajit, you want to add? Or Soumitra?
Sir, eye
Satyajit?
protection.
So care of the dependent eye and dependent earlobe pinna.
Yes, that is fine. That is very important. But for the surgical thing,
So the chest.
Okay, sir.
should
That
not be
that
and axilla, because that can
just
cause.
hold on. Soumitra is
sir,
recollecting something. Let's give him a chance.
the head, neck, and the cervical spine should be in a straight line.
So how you are going to
Sir,
make it?
that cannot be assessed from the head end. We have to go by the side of the patient to.
You can go anywhere. You can just run around the patient and all that. No problem.
So we have to go by the side of the patient to see that both the head, neck, and the spine should be at the same straight line.
So how do you do that?
Sir, that can be
Have
done.
Have you ever done
Yes, sir.
thoracotomy?
Yes, sir. That can be done.
What is the major concern of a surgeon when they look at the position?
A barrier should be placed at the back of the patient so that the position will not get displaced, and the patient should
that
be.
That is common sense. But
So
what actually says? Pardon?
Roll under the chest, so dependent lung.
Correct. That is very important. Why?
To keep the right side more up and should be better exposed. The ribs should be more departed.
Exactly, correct. So that is how means they have to open up the chest, right? But it causes us trouble. What trouble?
Sir, there is every possibility of the double lumen tube or the bronchial blocker to get dislodged or malposition.
No, means see, they are only keeping up to trachea and the bronchi, so they will not get dislodged. Anything else can happen.
Injury of the brachial plexus. Injury of the
brachial plexus at the level of nipple line? No, it doesn't occur like that.
Sir, there will be.
See what will happen. They open the chest. The right-sided lung is totally deflated, right? And if the left side is restricted because of this bolster, which is lying underneath, so that may cause deformation of the chest, and there may not be complete expansion of the lung. So you may struggle with oxygenation issues, right? You have paralyzed the patient, and there is a bolster on which the whole patient weight is going. So what will happen? It will deform that chest. So you may not be able to expand it. So it may contribute in the oxygenation issues, right? So that bolster under the chest also many a times can be a culprit. All right, so you have placed all the lines and the central lines and probably an epidural catheter I always prefer, because it is, for me, it's thoracic epidurals, it is very easy to place, right? And then you have separated, confirmed with FOB, placed the left-sided tube, right? And the surgery has started, okay? Now what are the issues? The major issue is that of?
Hypoxemia.
You
issues,
don't say straight away hypoxia.
Sir,
you say oxygenation issues.
Problem in
right?
oxygenation.
Yes. So
Actually,
how will you tackle that?
Sir, if there is hypoxemia, then it can be classified into two ways. If the hypoxemia is sudden onset and severe, then straightforward we should go with the two-lung ventilation. But if the hypoxemia is gradual and the desaturation is also gradual, then we can tackle that desaturation and hypoxemia in a different way, in the form of various steps should be taken, should be followed actually. Now, first of all, the FiO2 should be increased to 1. Then after increasing the FiO2 to 1, we should check the position of the double lumen tube both by auscultation as well as by the use of pyrotrophic bronchoscopy. After that,
see, auscultation is out because see, you have already opened the chest and surgery has started. There is no excess area.
Okay. So after that we should keep our, if using the inhalation anesthetic, we should keep the MAC less than 1 to keep the maximum advantage of the hypoxic permanent vasoconstriction. Then we will adequately optimize the cardiac output. The cardiac output should be optimized. After that, we can use the we can raise the PEEP of the dependent ventilated lung. If after this maneuvers still there is a desaturation hypoxemia, we can do the recruitment maneuver of the dependent ventilated lung. That is the in a pressure of 20 centimeters H2O, we should keep the lungs inflated for 10 to 15 seconds. If after these efforts there is still hypoxemia, then we have to do some maneuvers in the non-dependent, non-ventilating lung. In the non-dependent, non-ventilating lung, we should apply the...
No, when you are talking about this patient, then always say, don't say non-dependent, non-ventilated. Look, say the right-sided lung, because we know about this patient.
Okay, sir. So in the right-sided lung, we can go for the application of CPAP around 1 to 2 centimeter H2O. But prior to application of the CPAP, we should recruit the lung. So the benefit of the application of CPAP following recruitment maneuver is better. And apart from this, there are certain ventilating maneuver in the right-sided lung. Number one, we can intermittently provide intermittent positive pressure ventilation. We can provide oxygen insufflation directly into the right-sided lung through the bronchoscopic suction port of the bronchoscope, pyrotrophic bronchoscope. We can provide the oxygen insufflation in the area which is not included in the lobar area, which is not included in the operative site. And also, we should deflate the lobar area, which is specifically taken for the surgical removal. If in spite of all these maneuvers, there is hypoxemia, then we can use some pharmacological intervention, like we can omit the use of vasodilators, which probably is getting used for the control hypertension, like nitroglycerin, nitroprusside, and they actually
Why
prevent
this patient, is this patient taking these drugs?
So if
Why you are giving these drugs to this patient?
Sir, if there is hypertension in the intraoperative period,
No, there is no hypertension and
Okay,
there is
okay.
no usage of all that.
Okay. So there is no use of this vasodilating drugs. We can use the almiterine infusion, though I have not seen or used it for vasoconstricting.
Almiterine, what for?
Sir, for the vasoconstricting property, it enhances the hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction.
No, these are all very dangerous drugs. They should not be used.
Okay, sir. Okay.
What
Okay.
else?
Sir,
What else can be done?
So we can use nitric oxide in the left-sided lung.
Nitric oxide. Why? You know, delivery of nitric oxide, it's not a very simple thing.
Sir, the combination of
It never helps. It never helps.
Okay, sir. Okay. So in spite of all these
Satyajit wants to say something.
Mechanical restrictions of the blood flow in the right side of the lung by
Yes, that can be tried. Okay, but it comes with a cost. What is the cost? Surgeon may apply a partial clamp to hold the flow to the right side, because right-sided lung is bigger than the left-sided lung.
Yes, sir.
Right? So it has more flows. Have you floated a pulmonary artery catheter? Most of the times it goes on the right side. Have you floated a pulmonary artery catheter?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right? So most of the times you find it's going into the right side.
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So the curvature is like that and the flow is more. So it always takes the higher flow. So partial clamp. So what the problems can occur, which you have to watch.
Sir, problem
Now
is
let
that
Satyajit tell.
Sir, problem there would be the decreased ventilation perfusion mismatch will be there.
No, when you try to partially clamp your flow to the right side of the lung so that the shunting doesn't occur, right?
Yes, sir.
So, but what problems it can cause?
This can causes ischemia to the
Ischemia. Anything else?
sorry, sir, I can't.
So RV dysfunction or decreased.
Yes, who said that? Prachi said that. Yes.
Yes, sir.
You have to be careful about. Look at the central venous pressures and all that, right? They are not unnecessarily rising because that may cause a strain on the right side, right? So, and that you don't want. An acute strain, and there may be trouble. So, and supposing you are not able to, whatever you do, the saturations are just falling down.
So resume two-lung ventilation and supine position.
Yes, and ask the surgeons. And that is why in this thoracic surgery, a very good rapport between both the teams, the anesthetic teams and the surgical team. That is very important. Both of them have to understand each other in a better way, right? It is not one man's story. Oxygenation is the doing of the surgeons, right? You are struggling because of the surgeons. They are operating and they are deflating the lung. So that is important. You have to tell them that, look here, we are going to inflate the lungs. Bring up the oxygenation of the patient. And then if it actually, the patient is not able to hold that, then they can actually, see, lung is a very, very sensitive organ. Means you can put some weight on it and it will get deflated. So it can be perfused. It can have its due share of gases, but also it is not coming in the field of surgery also. If surgeon knows how to do it. So that is how it can be done. Okay. So you took out the lobe, right? And everything is fine and all that. So, and you have closed it. You have not placed the epidural catheter. So for pain, surgeon can do something. What he can do at this point before closing.
So intercostal nerve block.
Intercostal.
Can give.
That surgeon usually doesn't give. That's we give it at the end of the surgery. What surgeons can do?
So paravertebral catheter can be
Yes,
placed by the surgeon
correct.
under direct vision.
Correct. So paravertebral, if you have placed it, sometimes you may not be the putting up of this thoracic epidural. Well, if you are doing it regularly, then it is very easy. And if you are doing it very sparingly, then it may create some problems. Or if you are using ultrasound, because we can use ultrasound also to assist in putting up these epidurals. So it becomes easy. But if supposing you are not able to place an epidural, then you can ask the surgeon to put a paravertebral under direct vision. Posteriorly, they can place a paravertebral catheter, and it is taken out separately, not from the surgical incision, not from the ICD, which they will place at the end of the surgery. It has to come out separately from a separate port that you can use. That is that. Once you close it up, you bring out to the ICU. And what all important is that you have to maintain the temperature. I think who said that? Any of you has said that patient has to be kept warm. And then at the end of the surgery, once it is all sewn up, what will you do? Prachi?
Shift the patient to. I didn't get
Straight
the
away?
question, sir.
A patient is means
No, the
at the
patient
end of
will-
the surgery.
The patient position has to be changed to supine position. Start an epidural infusion, maintenance infusion if we have inserted an epidural catheter, and it has to be checked
Or
initially.
paravertebral catheter.
Yeah, or a vertebral catheter. And if we are planning to extubate the patient,
And if there is no catheter, then you this is the point when you
we
give
insert a hand. So a paravertebral
what you insert.
block.
No,
So
don't,
we can give a
you can also
Yes,
give,
sir.
yes, you can also give paravertebral block at the end of the surgery.
Yes,
or
sir.
you can also give
Intercostal block.
intercostal nerve block.
intercostal nerve blocks. Yes. So they are equally good, right? And what you use in these blocks, infusions and all that?
So bupivacaine, sir, 0.25 to 0.5% bupivacaine.
And
is
any
and
adjuvant?
so fentanyl, but not usually
Fentanyl is
paravertebral.
quite short-lived. Any other
So
better?
morphine, sir.
Morphine, any other? Non-opioid? Which increases the duration? Yes, what Satyajit says. Dexamethasone, yes. That can be added for very prolonged effect, you know, even with your intercostal blocks. If you use it, then you will find that really the effect may stay for 18 hours, 20 hours, or even 24 hours. Single injection. So blocks are done, and then you have placed the patient in a supine position, and then
changing the tube to a single lumen tube, sir, because he's a DLT. If we plan to extubate or plan to shift the patient to ITU on elective ventilation, so we have to change to a
the
single
question
lumen
arises
tube.
when you think of extubating this patient on table. Palla?
Sir, we can see if we have calculated the predicted post-operative FEV1, if it is more than 40%, and
how you are going to measure that?
So like pre-operative, we know the FEV1. So if we have calculated
don't talk irrelevant, right? We don't. Nobody does the FEV1 assessment there, right? It has been taken out. We know we have already done it in the beginning. That well, after that it will be like that. Okay. Now, what else?
So we, if we are planning
say points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right?
Yes, sir. So if the surgery has been, there has been not much of blood loss, there is not too much of hemodynamic instability, and the patient, if you are planning to extubate, is alert and awake and conscious, and he is having adequate pain relief, we can consider extubation in the operation theater itself. But
And
if
now, what else? See, he is warm, right? And surgery has went very smooth, and adequate analgesia has been given. And what else?
Patient is alert and comfortable.
And
Stable
Sir,
hemodynamics.
yes, we have said that. And
Sir, some parameters which can be assessed in the preoperative period, like predictive postoperative FEV1, number one, and number two, patient is having adequate cardiopulmonary interaction function is good. The VQ scintigraphy is good.
no, blood pressure is, where are you going now? See, you are in the operation theater, right? Heart rate has remained stable. Patient's blood pressure is fine. There is no unusual bleeding, right? Patient is warm, and adequate pain
And good
relief
amount
has
of
been done. And
good
what
amount
else?
of oxygenation is good in the
Patient is able to breathe well, generate adequate tidal volume. That is also important, right? Patient is able to do that, right? Patient is coming out. If you say patient is awake, then you ask the patient to take breaths. Patient is able to do that, right? So then probably that is the point that you may think about extubating the patient. If it is not like that, if you have struggled, it was a long surgery, patient has low body temperature, there was too much of fluid exchanges during the surgery, you have to give lots of either blood or fluids and all, right? And it was difficult to maintain hemodynamics, then probably you will not extubate this patient on table, bring him into the ICU, keep him for some time, let him warm up, let him get stabilized, right? And then you extubate, right? So what do you do? If you are not going to extubate on the table, then what do you do?
The double lumen should be exchanged with the single lumen tube.
Yes, it is better to change the double lumen tube with a single lumen tube, right?
Yes. Then
And
the two-lung ventilation is
so what
resumed.
do you think that this exchange of tubes is a simple, it is as simple or it is as simple as it was in the beginning?
No, sir. If the surgical duration is prolonged, then there is possibility of glottic edema, the airway edema. So placement of single lumen tube will be difficult. What we can do is we can choose a tube of 0.5 centimeter lower the diameter of the standard tube, which usually used for that patient.
You can, yes, you can keep it because these are tough, very thick, big tubes, right? Yes. And you have placed this patient in the left lateral position for a long time. Yes, so there is unusual pressure points inside the glottis, the trachea, and the bronchus. Yes. So there may be these kind of things there. So always remember that exchanging a tube, right, is really difficult. It is not just the same as it was right in the beginning when we were placing a double lumen tube.
Yes, sir.
His theory may be totally changed. So the way Soumitra says that you have to have one or two tubes, one or two point lesser in diameter available at that point of time. And there should be bougies, there should be distillate, means some aids have to be there for the exchange of this tube. That is very important. So you bring this patient to the intensive care unit, right? Now, what are the issues in caring for these patients in the intensive care unit? Satyajit?
Adequate pain management, hemodynamics, and adequate fluid management. And patients should be warm.
Now you have to define this adequacy. Adequacy is, means it may vary from one patient to the other patient.
Sir,
this is a lung case. You know?
Yes, sir. So regarding fluid management, the positive fluid balance not more than 20 ml per kg body weight. We should give in such a way that the positive fluid balance does not exceed 20 ml per kg body weight. And
means restricted fluid therapy. That is very important, right? Even if in the beginning, if your patient, supposing your patient becomes too negative when you are doing input-output charting, what could be the problems? Supposing I give you a scenario, this patient is on epidural analgesia, right? What is the problem in the immediate postoperative period?
There may be hemodynamic instability in the form of hypotension.
What is that instability?
Hypotension.
Always define, don't use this word hemodynamic instability, right? It means nothing unless you pinpoint exactly, right, what actually you think can happen.
There may be hypotensions and bradycardia.
Yes, this epidural, because you have actually placed a epidural. Yes, so it will affect your sympathetic outflow.
Yes, sir.
So these patients usually have hypotension. Okay, so for that, what you want to do? How you tackle this hypertension?
Judicious fluid administration plus...
there are two ways, right?
Yes,
fluids and vasoconstrictors.
Vasoconstrictor.
So here, early use of vasoconstrictors is important,
Yes.
right? And judicious use of fluids. You cannot just play with the fluids a lot. Why?
Because too much administrations of the fluid may causes the pulmonary edema, and there may be...
yes, you have actually manipulated this lung, though you have taken out the upper lobe, but still a major part of the lung is still lying down. And the surgeon has actually molded it, actually pressed it, compressed it, right? And there has been no perfusion or very much less perfusion for some time. So hyperoxia, once you start ventilating these lungs, there is hyperoxia, there may be free oxygen radicals, there will be severe inflammation. This is a leaking syndrome, and whatever fluid you give, that may collect inside the alveoli, around the alveoli, and the outside the alveoli. So all these things can happen, okay? And you will never be able to come to know about that what is happening to that fluid. It will not just, you are not able to see it. You only look at the oxygenation part, right? That somehow patient is not able to breathe. Those lungs have become stiffer post-surgery. And therefore, you have to restrict the fluids now that, okay? What else? So pain relief, hemodynamic control with the use of early use of vasoconstrictors, restricted fluids, and Soumitra, add further things.
Sir, further thing, there is a possibility of respiratory failure in the postoperative period if the patient is extubated, or there are other complications, like there is the possibility of hemorrhage, excessive bleeding,
supposing you find, how will you make out that there is a hemorrhage?
Sir, the drain will be excessive through the intercostal drain, number one. Number two, patient will be having hypotension.
Sudden severe hypertension, which cannot be explained by other measures. Right? So immediately you should think that maybe there may be a hemorrhage inside.
And if we do the ABG, there will be a reduction in the hematocrit also, and it also point out towards the ongoing hemorrhage.
Mm-hmm.
So chances of excessive bleeding and hemorrhage is there. And one very categorical complication in the postoperative period is cardiac herniation. Though it is less common in lobectomy, but still it can be happening.
It is in this patient. Can it be a cause? It is an right upper lobe.
No, sir. In right upper lobectomy, it is rare.
And when you look at the X-ray, you find that mass is quite away from the midline.
Yes, sir.
Right? And in the CT, we know that the hilar involvement is not there.
Yes, sir.
Pallav, that's what you told,
Yes,
no?
sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So it means that this mass is not sticking to the pericardium. And because it is the upper lobe, so the pericardium involved is actually near the major vessels of the heart,
Heart.
not the chambers where actually herniation can occur if the pericardium has been taken off along with the lung or something.
Lung
So
tissue.
if it is a lower lobe, if it is a very invasive mass in which the pericardium has been taken out, that note has to be made in the case sheet, because tackling heart herniation, cardiac herniation, is not easy. Most of the times patients die instantly, immediately, right? Before you are able to wheel that patient inside the OR, do a sternotomy or thoracotomy and then sew it up and close the gap. So cardiac herniation is an extreme dire emergency. It happens whenever the pericardium is taken out, then the surgeons usually refurbish it because it's there, right? So we know it, right, in the OR that can happen. It is a rare phenomenon otherwise.
Yeah, phenomenon.
And what else? Other complications?
Atrial fibrillation.
Very intelligent. Yes, atrial fibrillation. But it doesn't come immediately after hours. But why it occurs?
Sir, it occurs by two reasons.
It's a very, very common, means the rhythm disorder that is seen with these thoracotomies.
Sir,
Good,
it occurs because of two
Prachi,
reasons.
you really did very well.
Thank you, sir.
So why it occurs? Give me reasons also.
So because of the increased sympathetic activity, there might be increased RV strain. RV strain, sir.
Still, it is not very clearly known. It's not RV strain. What else? Why?
So I have read about these two factors, so increased sympathetic activity and the RV strain. I know about
sympathetic activity. How?
But right now, if the epidural is adequate, then it won't be the cause of sympathetic activity.
That's why AF doesn't occur in the early phase. It comes late.
Sir, because of reperfusion injury.
Reperfusion injury of what?
Sir, reperfusion of injury of the lung. I mean, because of reperfusion injury, there will be release of cytokines and inflammatory mediators. Those are sympathomimetic, and then they can cause postoperative atrial fibrillation.
Well, Soumitra is also right. Means that is also one of the said reasons, but we don't know exactly. What Prachi says, that the right heart strain, it means if you do a bigger resection, supposing pneumonectomy, then it is seen in more percentage of patients as compared to a simple upper lobe lobectomy, as it may occur in this kind of patient, right? So that is there, but still exactly it is not known. But a lot has been seen that maybe because of the underlying condition, because patient has been a smoker, the smokers also have a propensity of having these rhythm disorders, right? So that could be there, and probably, as Soumitra says, that there may be, because of the changes, because of these inflammatory changes occurring during the surgery and all, there may be. And most of them, these atrial fibrillations, means these supraventricular tachycardias, they are not the permanent feature. Means after some time, as they appear, they disappear also. So supposing you want to treat them, how do you treat them? Supposing after 12 hours, this patient develops atrial fibrillation. So how will you treat this?
Sir, first of all, if there is any electrolyte imbalance, that is hypokalemia and hypomagnesemia, that should be corrected. Hypoxia should be corrected.
Hypomagnesemia. How do you think about hypomagnesemia?
Sir, generally hypokalemia is present along with the hypomagnesemia, and the magnesium level should be checked.
Yes, if your potassium levels are, despite giving supplements, your potassium levels are not keeping, means they are keeping low, then you have to think about low magnesium as well. Yes, or you get a serum magnesium done.
Serum magnesium level.
Right? What is the normal level?
Sir, 2.2 to 4.3 milliequivalent per liter.
Okay. Milliequivalents. Okay.
Sir, after the correction of the electrolytes, the hypoxia, if there is any hypoxia, that should be corrected. No,
hypoxia is all. That's not an issue.
Okay. So if there is, if the pain is not adequate, if there is any sympathetic overactivity because of pain, anxiety, that should be corrected.
No. Everything is, you have taken care of everything. Now you want to treat this.
Then pharmacological management, the drug of choice is diltiazem. And if diltiazem is
no, don't ever tell like that. If you're talking about atrial fibrillation, then you say we have to look at what is the heart rate, means the LV rate. If it is very high, supposing the patient is to the range of 140, 150, 160, so
then
management will be different.
Intravenous amiodarone is should be used.
Amiodarone. Why you want to give amiodarone? Is it a good drug when you have lung problems? What it causes in the lungs?
It causes lung fibrosis, but in a chronic
phase.
phase.
And it is an acute fibrosis also can be caused by amiodarone.
Okay, sir.
You may not have seen cases. I have seen cases.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Within a week's time, it may cause, and that is very severe. And the outcome is very bad.
Okay.
So
beta blocker,
if it is
beta blocker.
Beta
blockers and
is said to be avoided actually because the airways are hyperactive and we do not know the.
But we have beta blockers. That was a story when there was a single beta blocker. Which was that?
Cardioselective propranolol.
Yes.
That is the cardio non-selective.
So we can use beta blockers, right? And then we may use calcium channel blockers like diltiazem, right? And then supposing if you're not able to, then you can think about amiodarone. And can we use digitalis also?
Usually it does not, it's not recommended in these patients.
Why?
Not sure.
Read it. You can't say not sure.
It's not recommended, yeah.
No, you have to read everything.
It's not effective actually, yes.
Who says that it's not effective? Have you used it?
No, sir. Not in these patients, no sir.
So you can't say it is not effective, right? There may be other problems, but you have to know about that. Okay, AF, and any other complications worth noting? There may be cardiac failure. Again, the reasons are exactly not known, but the patient may end up. And pulmonary failure. What is pulmonary failure? Acute pulmonary failure?
Sir, acute pulmonary failure is characterized by hypoxemia type 1. It is of two types, type 1 and type 2. In type 1, there will be both hypoxia and hypercarbia. That is PaO2 less than 60 and PCO2 more than 45 millimeters per Hg.
No, I'm talking about post-operative pulmonary failure, acute pulmonary failure in this patient.
So excessive perioperative use of IV fluids can cause post-pneumonectomy, pulmonary edema in such patients. It's for these patients. Sir.
Yes.
Excessive use of crystalloids. Sir.
And apart from fluids?
Increased stress, surgical stress can cause into
Yes,
leaky
again, means
capillaries,
many a times it happens
inflammation.
that you don't find pulmonary edema, but still these patients are not improving as far as oxygenation is concerned. They are retaining carbon dioxide, they are hypoxic, whatever you do, right? So this is actually acute pulmonary failure. Incidence is very less, but again, probably the cause is whenever we don't know anything about, then we blame inflammation and free oxygen radicals, right? These are our saving grace. You can put everything on their shoulders, make them the road in. But ultimately we find that it happens because of that one, all right? So it is there. All right, so we finished. I think we have talked a lot. And you guys have read means whatever you have not seen, try to read them, because everything will be, you can use all these things in your practice in future, right? So always like bronchial blockers and all that. And the pain management is important. Right? And also, can you use, you can also use IV pain, for the pain relief. You can use IV agents as well, right?
Patient control analgesia.
Yes, so that is also used a lot. It is used a lot. Why? Because you involve the patient in taking care of his own pain. So he becomes a party to it. And he enjoys that more. He will complain less. Okay? So that is there. And one more thing is there in this patient. Because Pallav told that the diaphragm is raised, there may be any other problems that can occur? Like on the right side, on the left side, they have their different problems. On the left side, there could be?
Sir, there could be nerve injury, like
nerve injuries
injury.
Can occur. Yes, so all
there
those
could
things
be
can occur.
there could be phrenic nerve injury also can be possible.
Can be there too. So you have to be careful about that. So all those things have to be taken care of. Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Saumi,
Yes, sir.
I think we finish off.
Yes, sir. We have come to the end, and thank you so much, sir, for asking such very important, pertinent questions. I'm sure the PDTs will make use of the questions and prepare themselves accordingly.
I hope they enjoyed the session. Soumitra, Pallav,
Yes, sir.
Satyajit,
Yes, sir.
Prachi.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Surely,
Was
yes,
sir.
I up to your expectations?
Yes, sir, you were, but we
Sir,
are not.
we weren't probably, sir.
You were definitely, but we are not probably.
Right? Why? Because I asked foolish questions.
No, sir. Our
No,
preparation,
sir.
I think
These
our
are very
preparation was not
practical
up to the mark.
questions, actually.
Sir,
Yes,
actually,
yes,
I
sir.
wanted to just put in a few more things, sir. There are some latest newer blocks around the corner, like the rectus spiny plane block and the serratus anterior plane block. Since thoracotomy is a very painful procedure, maybe we can also think about those blocks too.
See, erector spiny
University
block
guided.
and all means we have used, but to tell you frankly that they are too elaborate. I don't want to go inside a muscle, underneath a muscle, because these are all plain blocks. Now, plain
Correct.
blocks, they need enormous amount of drug. So why should we use that much of drug for a plain block that may go from means disperse in a very long segment, when we can actually see, I'm telling you, the people don't use, they just go by the jargon and the complexity of the block because they enjoy that. Erector spiny block, as if you have, you are going to the moon by a rocket. No, it's not like that. We have to look at how much drug we are using, right? Why should we use 30 ml of some local anesthetic agent depositing at some area, right? When we can actually work with only 10 ml of drug by giving intercostal blocks. They are the best blocks. They are very productive blocks. And if you add something, they can stay for, and in the ICU, go there, just walk around and give another block after 10 hours or 12 hours. That's it. Even epidural blocks we have seen that it causes so much of hypertension, we unnecessarily hook the patient up with the vasoconstrictors, right? And also, because of that, we may find that the patient, because patient is lying down, we want him to get up, but patient is lying down because of this catheter, because of this unnecessary infusion, right? And patient is not able to use his diaphragm, which is very important to cough out secretions. So there are so many things, right? So that's why these are new things. Read about them, but I'm telling you that for thoracic surgeries, these blocks, these so elaborate plain blocks, right? Means I don't know if they really give you enough advantage.
Sure, sir. Thank you, sir, for your insights. I'm sure we all benefit from it. And I would request Dr. Verma to close the session now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, sir, for taking out time and pain for us. And thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all.
Thanks. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.